We coordinate the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. We're delighted to welcome you here today to our final program for this semester and a preview to some of our spring activities, which will begin in January on the 24th with a program on migrant rights, and on the 26th with a program on international humanitarian law. And then we will be doing programming throughout the spring. But it is our great pleasure to welcome Linda Dittmar here today. Linda is a former faculty member at UMass Boston, and her early years were marked by turmoil of war and nation building as mandatory Palestine became Israel. Born in 1938 and growing into Israeli adulthood, she witnessed the intertwined effects of the Holocaust and the Nakba, the catastrophe of mass expulsion during the War of 1948. She grew up steeped in the Zionist convictions of the time and, like all Israelis, served in the IDF. In the United States since 1981, she received her doctorate from Stanford University, taught literature and film studies here in Boston, and had visiting lectureships in Tel Aviv, India, and elsewhere. Her work has been recognized by several residencies and awards, including 2 Fulbright Awards, the second as a distinguished chair. And her publications include From Hanoi to Hollywood, the Vietnam War and American Film, and Multiple Voices in Feminist Film Criticism. Most recently, she received a Mass Cultural Council Award for her work on her memoir, Tracing Homelands, Israel-Palestine and the Claims of Belonging, with segments having been published in a variety of local publications and international bulletins. Deeply anchored in history, Tracing Homelands is a braided account of Israel's early years of statehood in the Palestinian Nakba, remembered as a child growing into young adulthood, and now seen in retrospect with new eyes. I had the pleasure of reading the book. I urge you to take advantage of its availability with a 20% discount after the talk this afternoon. We all recognize that these are fractured times, very difficult moments in the history that Dr. Dittmar is going to be sharing with us. And we invite you to open your eyes and ears and to move into what some have called deep listening. And then together we'll have time for exchange, questions, and responses. We're delighted as the Center for Human Rights and International Justice to host this program. And we're delighted to have so many of you online and here with us this afternoon. Thank you for being with us, Linda.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Daniel Nackstrom, forgive me with the pronunciation, and Brinton, Lykes, and Timothy Karsh for your invitation and help. And I want to thank all of you for being here. It's a very difficult time right now for me as an Israeli American and for all of us at the moment. The book was written before the worst of times, which is now at a slightly better time, but things were very complicated then too. And the main focus of Tracing Homelands is indeed the question of whose homeland is it? Because there are 2 people, the Israelis and the Palestinians, both of them rightly claiming it as their homeland. I was thinking a lot about the fact that I'm going to talk about it within the context of human rights. And I'm not going to talk about it in terms of neither the philosophy nor the law of human rights. It's outside of my purview, really. But I'm going to talk about it as a personal experience. Tracing Homeland is a memoir. It really talks about my own experience growing up in Israel between 1939 and 1960, when I came to the United States, and then returning there many, many times since then. The situation right now with both the Hamas attack on Israel and the incredibly horrible attack on Gaza that is claiming so many lives is really beyond words. But we need to keep in mind that in the background is also the occupation of the West Bank as well, what we call also, some of us call the occupied territories. And the great amount of suffering and repression that people there are feeling drip by drip by drip every day of the year. So it's not only the drama of the fighting in Gaza that is happening at the moment, but a very long history. And my book actually centers on the war of 1948 when I was 10 years old, which means that I really didn't understand much of what was happening, but I still saw things and heard things. And it is, a lot of it is about my ignorance at that time. There was a very, a Palestinian village by the name of Sumail that was within half a mile of my parents' house. And before the war, we would see the farmers of Sumail, they grew wheat very near our fence. Camels would pass by and so on. And then one day they were just gone. They were just gone. Now, in that case, they went quietly rather than being shot in order to move. But that was happening. And I didn't know what it meant. I had no idea. It was only in 1993, I was talking with my partner at that time about Israel. And I mentioned casually that she has never been to Israel, that in Israel, when you see a clump of cactus growing someplace, it means there was a Palestinian village there before. And the reason is that the cactuses are those prickly pears are very hard to eradicate. And it is a kind of sign that people don't pay any attention to. It's like having an oak tree or a maple tree, and you just kind of take it for granted, essentially. But I grew to understand that about the cactuses. And since she was a landscape photographer, I thought it would interest her. And to my dismay, it interested her too much in the sense that she said, oh, let's go and photograph that. And at that point in 93, I said, I cannot take you to do that. And the reason I felt I cannot is that I felt that that is betraying what was then still a secret, a known but unmentionable secret in Israel. People did not yet use the word Nakba, which is the Arabic word that the Palestinians use to mean catastrophe. And that has to do with the expulsion of, numbers vary, but roughly 750,000 people who were expelled to Jordan, to Egypt, to Syria, and to Lebanon. All the refugees that are around there and now are in the Palestinian diaspora, some of them here in Boston, are all coming from those villages. So their parents, grandparents came from those villages. And there were about, depending on the estimate, about 450 maybe villages, depending how you count. At that time, I felt I can't do that. It was quite a lot later, 2005, when she finally came to Israel, and we went on what would have been just an ordinary touristic kind of trip. There is a place in the Lower Galilee called Beit She'an, it is basically a Greco-Roman, primarily Roman ruin with a wonderful amphitheater and mosaic floor and all those things that tourists like to see. And we went to see the place in Beit She'an. But we arrived too early because actually the country is tiny and we misjudged the distance. It was way too early to get there. And there was a road, a sign on the map for a scenic detour. And I said, let's take the scenic detour. And we drove on the scenic detour, and it was forested and hilly and very pretty and kind of late afternoon. And I saw on the left side of the road, that is the northern side of the road, stone markers that looked vaguely like tombstones, actually. And I said, let's stop and see what those stones are about. They're not together. There was one, and there a little bit later another, and a little bit later another. And it turned out they all had writing on them, and they were all contributions for forestry, for planting trees by various Jewish communities abroad. You know, there was something from the ex-synagogue in Canada, something else from a Jewish community that survived the Holocaust in some other place, and so on and so on. They were all memorial stones, basically for contributors. And remember, one of these big achievements of Israel, as people think of it, is making the desert bloom. And indeed, there's been a major, major project of forestry by the Jewish National Fund, entirely by contributions, anything from pennies that children give at school to big contributions that people give in other ways. And so that was one of those forests. However, I noticed that when I looked to the right side of the road, which looked south, the forest comes to a very abrupt end. And after that, there was completely just a plain mountainside with rocks and earth and nothing growing there. And further back to the south, you could see hills. And because it was evening, you could see lights beginning to show on those hills. And I suddenly realized where I am. And it is a double meaning in a way. I was in the mountains that in the Bible are called the Gilboa Mountains, which is where King David has his dirge for King Saul and his son Jonathan, who died in battle. And it's a very, very famous poem, dirge, that David says, and there I was. But the other thing I realized is that the lights on the other side are lights of the occupied territory. And that I was driving on a road that had memorials of the Holocaust on one side and basically the town of Jenin and the occupied territories on the other. It was just a horrible awareness, a horrible shock to see side by side how they were together, the suffering of one, the suffering of the other. Deborah, we both read a book, a very excellent book by Meron Benvenisti that basically traces the history, as he calls it, of the Holy Land after the War of 1948. And what he does is, in the book, is mainly trace ruins that remain hidden in forests and places like that. And so we had both read him before 2005. And when we were traveling in the forest, and I said, oh my gosh, look to the right, look at the Palestinian side, she said, and I'm seeing the ruins of a building among the trees. And there were some stones there. And I said, no, these are just stones. The country is covered with stones. If you ever travel there or will travel there, you'll see in the Galilee and in the mountain area, it's always strewn with rocks. So it's actually very hard to know. The next morning, we entered Beit She'an, and I won't tell you the whole story about it, but before entering the archaeological site, we meandered around and I came across an actual Palestinian house that it was being rehabilitated at that point for Jewish use. And I began to realize what we are doing. And at that point, that is really when my work on the Nakba and this book began. I spent 4 years on and off in the summer vacation, Christmas vacation, and 1 year on sabbatical, basically walking through the country and trying to find these places. We found about 10%, which is quite a lot. But what you find mostly is next to nothing. There's one place called Safuria or Tzipori, and in the Galilee. And again, this huge forest. And we just traveled in the forest to try and find something. And at some point I got fed up. I stayed in the car. I said, I'm not going out anymore. And there was a clump of cactuses. And Deborah went into that clump and called me. And you had to crawl into it with, you know, the pin, holding your hair, my hair. And inside there were just a few stones that were the remain of an arch. That's all there was. But I couldn't argue that these are just stones. They were connected in the form of an arch. Here and there in Israel, you'll find minarets and an occasional mosque still standing. But really, a lot of it, almost all of it, is extremely, extremely hard to find. And much of the book is describing places and how we got there and so on. There is a very excellent encyclopedic book by Rashid Khalidi called All That Remains. And in it, he lists every village and information from the British Mandate census, how many houses, what fields, how many people were there. Some of it is for the 30s and some of it is for the 40s. None of it is current, obviously. But he gives you a pretty good sense of life in those villages before the War of 1948, or before World War II, really, essentially, because all that work ended or got stopped around World War II. So we use Khalidi a lot. But the problem with Khalidi is that you come to this village, which is no longer named as such in the Israeli map. So you don't know where that village exactly is, and you need to kind of guess through various clues that, oh, maybe because Ein Ayala in Hebrew, Ayala is Ghazal in Arabic, therefore Ein Ayala would have been Ein Ghazal in all the days, you know, that kind of thing. Or that Tzipori today was Safuria before. There were clues in the language at times. And Khalidi would give a tiny bit more information, but his map was just an outline of a whole area with a dot and no road, no anything to help you find it. And I think that the really turning point for us was giving up on yet another trip. We had many trips that were useless, giving up on it. And on the way out of there, on some kind of very narrow minor road, I saw at a distance a platform of concrete. And Khalidi wrote that all that remained in that village was a well. And I said, let's go and look at the concrete slab. And under it was a space, and under it was that well. So in the book, I have a photograph of it, and I call it Khalidi's well. It was a miracle that we found it that way, but we developed a better sense of cues in the landscape and how to actually find places. So that is a lot about what that project was. But my book came later, and it really became an inquiry into my own people. We, the Israeli Jews, we, the Zionist Israelis, I'm not talking now about American Zionists because they have their own relationship, which is rather different than ours was at the time. But how did we, what did we do in founding a state, and what did we do in expelling the Palestinians as we did? And it may well be that many of you have heard, and that's not wrong, that when Israel was declared by the UN, all the surrounding Arab countries and even non-surrounding Arab countries like Iraq and Morocco sent armies against Israel at that time. So, you know, our justification has been they attacked us. We accepted the UN resolution, which was dividing the country rather unevenly in favor of the Jewish part, but the UN did that division and we accepted it. And then we got attacked by the Arabs and we had no choice but fight. That is basically the mainstream story. The reality is a little bit different, because the Arab armies, other than the Jordanians who were under British control, but other than them, they were weak, disorganized, and unmotivated to fight us. And they very often walked with bravado to some Palestinian village saying, we'll defend you, and then left them undefended. So actually the Arab countries essentially abandoned the Palestinians in that war. And at the same time, the Israeli militias that became armies were well trained and prepared for years before, partly because some of them served in the British Army during World War II, but also because mainly the Haganah and the Palmach really systematically trained in preparation for needing what they felt would be self-defense. But it became much more than just self-defense as things evolved. And they just had this superior power. And the fact that I learned only recently, I keep doing research, and I did not know about it, is that shortly after the UN declaration, the United States started hesitating about supporting the partition. And right now there's a big debate about 2 states versus 1 state. United States didn't back away from it, but it started hesitating. The Soviet Union was the great supporter of the partition. And the reason was that Israel at that time was a socialist country. And when I was growing up on May Day, the streets were filled with parades and red flags. And the Soviet Union expected that we will become a satellite and a resource to them at that point. And they supported us, and not only that, they sent a major shipment of guns. They sent rifles from Czechoslovakia. And I was in the army, and I trained on one of those Czech guns, actually. And they also sent airplanes to the Israeli army. So, I don't know if we would have won the war without the help of the Soviet Union, actually, ironically. And within a very short time, they discovered that we are actually more pro-West, and they gave up on us because we were not going to become a satellite, and things changed. But the other thing, beyond the history, which I keep reading about all the time, I asked myself, how was I brought up as a kid in Israel? And there are certain landmarks in my own typical education, completely typical education in Tel Aviv, that I mentioned in the book. And 2 of them occurred during Hanukkah pageant. Instead of the Christmas pageant, we had our Hanukkah pageant for the whole school. And the first was a dramatic performance of the story of Hannah and her 7 sons. The Greek king Antiochus wants to convert the Jews to worship of the god Apollo. He calls the mother and her sons to him. He tells the oldest son to bow to the statue of Apollo. The boy refuses. He's killed. Second son killed, and so on, until it comes to the youngest toddler, and even he refuses and is killed. And the big moment of that play is, of course, the grieving mother that some 11-year-old girl would perform in great drama. The second act there was the graduating class every year at the age 14, going up on the stage as a group and declaiming a poem called The Silver Platter by Natan Alterman. And that poem is about a youth and a girl, a boy and a girl, who are battle-weary and full of grime from fighting, and they fall to the feet of the state. There's an abstraction of the state, and say to her, we are the ones who are giving you the state on a silver platter. That is readiness now to sacrifice ourselves to build a state. And the issue of sacrifice is crucial, because 3 years later, just before we enter the army, and I did that too, they take us on a 4-day hike in the desert, which culminates in a climb up to Mount Masada. Mount Masada, if you don't know, was a fortress that was fortified by King Herod, actually. And the Jews withstood the Roman attack on it for 3 years. And when they saw that they're going to lose that attack, they committed mass suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Romans and be enslaved. So it became a major symbol of Jewish heroism. And if any of you have gone there or will ever go there, you will be told that story over and again and being shown the palace and fortification. We climbed on nowadays you can take a cable car. We climbed on the zigzag, impossible hike uphill before dawn and came up there, and there was a swearing in with torches on the mountaintop, swearing loyalty to the state. Each person is given a Bible at that point. And that is a pre-army event, big event. I'm just mentioning those to say I completely was moved by that, moved by the idea that we have to give our life to the country if needed. It's not what Kennedy said, don't ask what the country can do for you, ask yourself what you can do for the country. I felt it and believed it with my whole heart. So waking out of that to see the Nakba was a very difficult experience. I want to read to you now just a little bit. I don't know, how are we doing on time? 10 more minutes?
10 more minutes, yes.
Oh dear. Oh dear, that's terrible. Okay. You might, when traveling in Israel, you might not notice the prickly pear bushes that used to enclose a yard or a fence of some animals. At a distance, they are just pale grayish-green patches, sometimes whole banks of them. Such clumps dot the land, dense with thorny paths that render them impassable. They hover at the smoggy margin of our Jewish awareness, along with remnants of demolished houses, neglected orchards, and the odd minaret or sheikh's tomb, the Arab street names that were gradually replaced by Hebrew ones, the Arabic words that entered our victorious slang. Victorious and aglow with accounts of Jewish heroism, our response to the Nazi atrocities that continue to sear our collective memory, we had only contempt for the people we called the Arabs, denying their local identity, steeped in dread of the unknown ahead of us. The pre-48 Jewish population, the Yishuv, and the newly arrived Jewish refugees clung together in a desperate need to ensure our own survival. The Nakba was a ghostly presence we could not afford to see. Of course, I rejected Deborah's suggestion that we document the Nakba. It took 12 years for my resistance to crumble, not because of any sudden awakening or flash of life-changing insight, but through a slow journey into a murky territory where harsh realities kept crashing against the mythic utopian Zionism. Giving the Nakba image and voice, I hoped would make peace and restitution possible. And I do want to say that the intention of that work and of this book is really the intention for peace, not to further aggravate things, but something like the same thinking that went into Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa. We have to say the truth. Photographing the residues of the Nakba would not be about hazily remote wars, as Deborah's early work had been, but about fighting alive within memory and continuing in Gaza, in the Golan, in the occupied territories, and inside Israel itself. This slow and painful process of peeling the film off my eyes is the subject of this book. Growing up in British Palestine as it became Israel, and born to a Zionist family that settled there in the 19th century. My forebears came there in 1882, actually. I was steeped in our own narrative of national becoming, ancient expulsions and migrations, conquests and exiles, the Spanish Inquisition, ravaging pogroms and the Holocaust, the early Aliyah immigration with women dying in childbirth and the pioneers dying of malaria, the ghetto fighters and Jewish partisans of World War II, Hannah Senesh parachuting into Nazi-occupied Hungary to rescue Jews, Britain denying Europe's Jewish refugees shelter in Palestine, and much more. I would add the United States denying entry to Jewish refugees as well after the war. Tragedy and heroism were entwined in this story as I was taught it at school, in the neighborhood, and at home. Bekol dor vador, in every generation, as the Passover Haggadah tells us, they rise to annihilate us. They, shape-shifting from one era to the next, always against us. Ours was not Hollywood's frothy tale of handsome, blue-eyed Paul Newman leading the ship Exodus to safe haven as Ari Ben Canaan, but a grim history where the rules of engagement and the supposed ethics of combat crumbled. In my young imagination, this history was bound between the heroic defenders of Tel Chai and the youths who, in 1948, risked their lives to defend the convoys to besiege Jerusalem at the narrow ravine of Bab el-Wad. For me, growing up in fledgling Israel, training through high school in the Gadna youth brigades, and then serving in the Israeli Defense Forces, there was nothing more inspiring than our shared love of the land and our pride in our nation. These were, I truly believed, the only just responses to the appalling history we had inherited. I'll stop. There was so much more I wanted to say, and I really need to give you time to raise concerns and questions as you want to. But I just want to say that the book picks up this thread of heroism, Israeli heroism, and actually traces the way in which that thread can so directly lead to the horrible stuff going on in Gaza today. You know, that the notion of self-defense and profound trauma can then visit itself on somebody else. That is really the issue. And we know it in family therapy, that a child who was abused is likely to be the abuser of the next generation if he has a child. I think of it here too. Both we and the Palestinians, in totally different ways, are completely trauma-ridden. And that is part of the problem of any kind of reconciliation to be done with two nations, two people who need therapy, essentially, to recover from what they've been through, each of them, and be willing to trust and talk to one another. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so very much. I'll open it for questions, and can you please introduce yourself briefly as you ask a question or comment? Yes.
Hi, my name is Josh Geller. I'm a third-year law student at Boston College. Thank you so much for coming to speak today. I appreciate your balanced perspective. I'm an Orthodox Jew, so I obviously have a very deep connection to the state of Israel, as do you. But one of my concerns is the use of the term Nakba, because in my estimation, and I'll explain as I go along, and I hope this is not too long-winded of a question, and if it is, you can stop me. The use of the term Nakba has turned into a little bit of a revisionist phrase. Originally, it was coined by a Syrian professor named Konstantin Zurich, and what that was to what that was to symbolize was the Arabs, and as you mentioned, the Arab states' failure in waging war against Israel in 1948 when they declared their independence. And from there, it was also the Arab leadership that encouraged, for example, in the Battle of Haifa, Hajj Amin al-Husseini had encouraged, and many other leaders had encouraged Arabs to leave because they were going to win the war. But the reason why I believe it's a revisionist term is because what ends up happening is with the term Nakba is today, people like Ilan Pape use it to say Israel is committing a genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. When now, if you look at what was happening in when Jews started resettling the land in the 1880s, and Jews had always lived there, for example, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the population of the spot was around 10 to 15,000 Jews. And when Jews started moving in, Palestinian leaders like Hajj Amin al-Husseini had explicitly called for the spilling of Jewish blood and the ethnic cleansing. And in the 1940s, he had met with Hitler to deal with the Jewish problem and exterminate the Jews and kick them out of the land of Israel. And also to note, when Jews moved into Israel, many of them, 3/4 of the land that was purchased was bought from absentee landlords who controlled it from Syria and from Lebanon, as Palestine was a lot of Palestine was a sanjak of the Ottoman from the Ottoman Empire.
So Josh, thank you for the introduction. Can you ask the question, please? Not to interrupt,
Yeah,
but we have
sure.
other people.
So the question basically is how can you defend the use of the term Nakba, considering the history of the explicit call for Jewish extermination from the land, when then in 1948, what had happened also is that about 150,000 Arabs who were living in Jerusalem, oh, sorry, not Jerusalem, in mandatory Palestine, were granted full citizen under the Israeli Declaration.
Okay, your main question is about the use of the word Nakba?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I had to get out.
Yeah, no,
a lot
I
of history because
understand.
I think that gets lost in the term Nakba. That's my.
No, I understand, and thank you for the point about the Nakba and the broader historical perception, contextualizing that you're giving it. I can't be responsible for people who are misusing that word. Right now, in the demonstrations that we are seeing, people are also conflating Hamas with all Palestinians. People do that. People and Israelis have sometimes called a criticism of Israel as being Nazi, which is also a conflation. People use rhetoric for their own purposes. I'm not doing that. I'm using Nakba in the original sense that it was being used as a catastrophe. That's what literally the word means. That's what I mean. And I'm using it specifically to the catastrophe of Palestinian expulsion and not other catastrophes that could have happened, like the plague that was there at one time, or an earthquake, or whatever. What you're saying about Hajj Amin al-Husseini is a separate issue. The only thing I would correct you on is that there were claims of broadcasts to the Palestinian population by the leaders to leave the country because they'll be able to come back, and never have any recordings of that broadcast been found. So, maybe they were, but there's absolutely no proof for that. But basically, I use the word Nakba as my shorthand instead of calling it ethnic cleansing. It's just a few less syllables. That's all.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just want to say something quickly, since he was a law student and there's some faculty from law school here. I just wanted to thank you for raising that question.
Yeah.
These are very hard issues. It takes a lot what we're trying to do is facilitate dialogue over these hard questions. I think we can't possibly answer questions like this entirely in this format, but I hope we can find ways to continue these discussions in this way. There's so much that all of us need to learn about this. So I do appreciate you raising the question. I thank you for that.
Yeah, I second that, and also invite you to talk to me more in another context. So any of you, if you need to, yeah.
So I have a question here from online. A participant participated in Denver calling for a permanent ceasefire and end to U.S. aid to Israel this past weekend and discussed your work among other things. And the participant thanks you for writing this book, but wants to know what you think the U.S. needs to do to end the occupation. A small question.
I want to say that I feel the U.S. took wrong paths all the way back to 1940s, all the way back to Eisenhower's time. And also that my impression, without having any inside knowledge, is that neither the State Department nor the CIA have ever been clear about what they want or even in agreement with one another at times. But I feel very critical, actually, of the United States in all of that. I think that Israel is an important asset to the United States. It is an asset in intelligence, potential bases, all kinds of ways. It is the unquestionable friend in the Middle East, beyond any doubt, a reliable friend until recently. I think Israel now under Netanyahu is beginning to thumb its nose at the United States. But at the same time, Biden is not pushing them all that hard. So I can't speak about this current moment. My own feeling is that the United States years ago, had to insist on either two-state or one-state arrangement, and didn't, and basically allowed Israel to call the shots. And the reasons are understandable beyond the political interest that the United States really does have there, is also the whole issue of European guilt towards the Jews for anti-Semitism. And trying in some way to make a reparation for it, or at least say, well, we didn't mean to, or we are good people anyway. So there is a moral dimension to it that is very powerful in the United States. There is a strong Jewish pressure inside the United States to support Israel, unquestionably. And then there are the interests of the United States, and they all cohere with one another as I see it. So what can the United States do? I think that beyond what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are saying, that they disapprove of so much killing, I think they should put some material incentives to stop what's going on in Gaza. Now, there's another side to it, which is that what kind of truce can you make with Hamas is a separate question. They can put pressure on Israel, but what pressure can they put on Hamas and on the Palestinians is another question. And I just heard an Israeli podcast in Hebrew, so I can't really recommend it to you, but it was about the religious ideology of Hamas. And according to that particular branch of Islam, and that's not conflated with all Islam, but that particular branch does not believe that it is possible to have peace with infidels, period. You can have truce, you can have temporary peace, but you can't have real peace. Now, the person who gave that podcast was very reliable. He actually studied the Quran with Sheikh Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas. So he knew what he was talking about. But it is a sobering comment about who do we have to talk with, even if the United States put that pressure on Israel. Anyway, I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Follow up on that.
Can you introduce yourself?
Environmental professor Jeff Bally, so I know environmental stuff, but not this. But given what you just said about Hamas and agreeing that there shouldn't be all this bombing of civilians by Israel and so forth, but doesn't Israel need to take over all of Gaza? And they're not going to get rid of Hamas, but at least they'll get rid of them covering Gaza. And then, yes, push for the end of settlements and so forth. But how could you a truce and leave Hamas in control of any part of Gaza and expect any kind of peace.
That is completely how, that's the reasoning of the Israeli government. Clearly, that is exactly how they're reasoning it. My hesitation about it or question is that we are having a whole new generation of children who will become adults now, who have seen their families killed, their siblings' body parts in the street, the smell of dead bodies everywhere, and so on. These kids are not going to want peace. So, you know, the question is, what's the road to peace? And some experts, not me, I'm not a political scientist, but some people feel that anyway, you can't really eradicate Hamas. And any of you who reads the London Review of Books, and if not, I highly recommend that paper. Just now, there is an amazing article about Hezbollah in the north. And Hezbollah is much more well-coordinated, well-trained, and well-led than Hamas ever was, and much more dangerous. We are not going to have peace that way. That is, by killing them off is not going to get us anywhere, because the seeds of hate, the seeds of pain, the seeds of anger will just keep getting worse and worse. That's all we've seen from 1948 to today. That's all we've seen, is it getting worse.
Okay, we have two questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking. Kind of going off that, I'm Kate. I'm one of the interns for the Center for Human Rights. I thought it was really powerful, kind of what you talked about, likening it to family therapy, this idea of generational trauma, as you're speaking of now, this new generation being born into just continuing that cycle. And how you spoke about your focus, almost similar to how this effort of truth telling and bringing about reconciliation and peace that way. But, no small, easy answer or question, but with these new events, obviously, what path do you see towards truth telling as a means?
I couldn't hear the question then.
Like in light of the new events going on, your idea of using truth telling for reconciliation and trying to break this cycle of trauma. Like you said, you're obviously not a politician, but what means could you see towards moving in that direction and trying to break this cycle in a different way?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't see us breaking the cycle now, and maybe not even in my lifetime, because right now the anger and hate are immense, and I don't see a way of just, sitting and having hummus together or something and getting over that heritage that we are carrying and creating this very minute. I would also say that some people, including probably some people in this room, will feel that the idea of truth-telling and dialogue, which in the long run is what I would like, is sentimental and foolish. Okay, I mean, we have to take that into, I have to take that into account. This is what I believe. This is how I relate with people. It doesn't mean that my nation will. It doesn't mean that America or Hamas will, or that the Palestinians won't embrace more of Hamas and more of Hezbollah. They have no incentive to talk friendlyly to us at this point. And as a matter of fact, I have a very hard time talking to Palestinians because I'm so defensive. I know that they can be very angry at me and won't want to talk with me. I mean, it's and many Israelis don't want to talk with them. So yeah, I think that I'm talking about my own beliefs in human decency as above all, and sometimes in history we see it working every so often, and many times it doesn't. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dittmar. I'm Emerita. I'm an assistant professor in the biology department. So thank you so much for your work, labor, humanity, and sharing your perspective and history. So we have been talking about what has been happening in the last 2 months since October 7, but there is the history that you have experienced yourself. Two main human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, has described Israel as an apartheid regime for several years. And this is like the last apartheid regime in the world. How did Israel became an apartheid state and country? Because as you said, the Jewish intellectuals who came from Europe came with many ideals, and you said that it was a social state once with these high ideals. How did it become this? Like, how did anti-Arab racism increase so much and institutional become the regime in Israel?
Yeah, it's a difficult question that you're raising, but there's a French saying that the appetite comes with the eating, and Israel became strong. And then there was the war of 1967, where it suddenly captured an immense amount of land that it did not expect to capture. And actually, when it did, Ben-Gurion, who was no longer the head of the government, the prime minister, but sort of pushed aside, he told people to return the territory immediately for peace. And the people who were in power then, Dayan, the military commander, and others, didn't want to do that anymore. We have it. And the idea of, you cannot imagine the euphoria that was in Israel to be able to access Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, and especially the Wailing Wall, which was denied them for so many years. The euphoria in the country was unbelievable. And so, I think that the power and arrogance of power and the ability to use power, all of that really, in my mind, went to our head. But other people will say, look, we are flourishing. We are really we are rich, we are strong, we are happy, our restaurants are full, our movies are great, our literature is great, our science is great. I mean, why give it up? I mean, this country has done miracles in many ways. One of them is the revival of the Hebrew language as a spoken language. It's extraordinary that happened. So in a way, if you have something, what is the incentive to give it up? If you feel you can always have it. And it's okay, so we attack Gaza a little bit because they are a pain in the neck.
I would also say, if I may weigh in, that we may have future discussions, and I think should have future discussions about whether terms like apartheid really are the best labels to put on this. I mean, all of these terms, Nakba, apartheid, genocide, they're so fraught, they're so complicated that I think you need more conversation about that too. We can't do it today.
I use about human rights organizations.
Yeah, some do and some don't. There's a debate in the human rights community about this as well.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to comment on that word as well, like the Nakba, that when people started using it, and I remember Jimmy Carter using that word, I thought it was the wrong word, because in South Africa, apartheid was a way of turning the African people into workers for the state, exploited that way. Well, Israel wanted them away completely. So, these were two different intentions. Now everybody uses apartheid, so I use apartheid, but I have that problem, yeah.
So there's another question from online, and then we'll have one more question after that from here, if anyone has one. This commenter asks or states that many progressive Jewish activists from Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, have been called traitors and blamed for the rise in anti-Semitism, for calling Palestinians and calling for liberation. Have you ever been called a traitor yourself? What would you say to other Jews who are working towards peace but are being vilified by Zionists?
Yeah, I was actually. There is something called the Canary Project, and I am on it. And that was, they quoted me from an interview that I did quite before the book was published, where I said that when Deborah asked that we photograph those cactuses, I said, no, I can't be a traitor to my own country. So they took it out of context to show that I'm a traitor to my country. Oh. And when I saw it, I was actually totally dismayed. I was horrified. And I called my son and told him that I'm now on the Canary Project, and he said to me, "Mom, I'm proud of you." So, so that changed my perspective on that. But I think the attempts to vilify people is just really an attempt to shut down debate. And there's no justification to attacking people who have opinions that are just a verbal discussion, like the two of us, having a discussion and the disagreement. It's perfectly okay, and one or the other of us may learn something out of that, hopefully, So I feel like the people who are peaceful demonstrators or vocal but peaceful demonstrators, I support them. I don't share all their slogans, by the way. The slogan "from the river to the sea," I totally cannot share, because really it simply reverses the Zionist idea of from the sea to the river. They want the whole country. I can't take that particular slogan. But in general, free speech is completely legitimate. And if not, what are we doing in this room? No.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Hi, my name is JD Sanchez. I'm a senior here at BC.
Can you talk louder?
Sorry. My name is JD. I'm a senior here at BC. I was wondering, you mentioned generational trauma. Do you think that has to do with the rise of like more conservative movement in Israel than a leader like Netanyahu taking power, or do you think it's other factors as well?
I think I'm sorry, but you're asking if that change in Israel is generational, right?
If it has to do with the trauma.
Yeah, with the trauma. For Netanyahu personally, yes, by coincidence, if we want to get into his personal biography, but he has two things to deal with. One of them is his brother, who died really by Israeli standards and mine, a hero's death, trying to rescue Jewish captives from Entebbe in Uganda. So, that was, and the brother was supposedly the more bright of the two brothers and so on. So he's trying to live up to that. But the other thing is actually Netanyahu's own father, who was an academic and a historian. And his perception of history is very much rooted in the Spanish Inquisition and precisely what I was reading earlier, the idea that in every generation, bechol dor vador, they're coming on us to destroy us. So it was an approach to Zionism that saw Zionism as a continuous fortress against enemy attacks, essentially. And Netanyahu grew up with both of those ideologies, his brother's image and his father's ideology. His father, by the way, was so extreme in his position that he, as a student at the Hebrew University, petitioned to expel the head of the university. I forget the name that they had for it at the time, but Rabbi Yehuda Magnus, because he was for coexistence with the Palestinians at the time. And Mr. Ben-Zion Netanyahu actually had a petition to get rid of him. But that is the heritage that we can't put everything on Netanyahu. We have to think about the whole history and the whole community that votes for Netanyahu. And there's one thing I do want to mention, I take the moment,
yes.
And that is one of his people, Smotrich, was traveling around. He was here in America and he was in France. And I happened to see a photograph of him giving a talk in France. He's at the podium and there's a banner hanging in front of the podium. And I'm willing to bet that almost nobody knew what the banner showed. It was just a shape. The shape was of what some extreme Israeli Zionists, and maybe not only Israelis, believe, two banks to the Jordan, which includes not only the map of Palestine, but the kingdom of Jordan as part of Israel. And that was the insignia that was used by the IZL or the Irgun before the state as their button kind of insignia that they wore. And it had that combined map of Israel, of Palestine and Jordan, a hand over it holding a gun, and the words under it were rak kach, which means only this way. And that's what that it was. The Haganah came and took that away. But Smotrich, today, that is what he thinks.
Wow. Thank you so very much for being with us. Thank you all for your important questions. And as Dan mentioned, we will be having more opportunities for such conversations as the semester unfolds in the spring. And we look forward to having you and others with us for those discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
I have a
that's not-
question, but
Yes.
I wanted
You
to
can
give
talk.
other